Most salespeople don't know how to really run a sales discovery call. But the thing is, knowing how to run one is the difference between chasing leads and building relationships that actually close deals. And it all starts with discovering your prospect's real needs. Not the needs that they tell you, not the needs that they came into the call with, the actual real needs. So how do you have a productive conversation with someone that uncovers their pain points and sets you up for the close? Well, forget winging it, you need some strategy. And in this video, I'm going to unveil a powerful process to skyrocket your closing rate to 50, 60, 70, 80% and beyond. So stick around. Okay, so you've exchanged some pleasantries with your prospect. Now it's time to build some actual rapport. It's time to shift gears and steer the conversation towards uncovering your prospect's real needs. But how do you do that without sounding pushy and weird and gross and just boring them half to death by asking them monotonous questions that they've heard a million times before? Well, Deb Calvert recently suggested a slightly different approach on an episode of the Salesman podcast.
The fastest, quickest way to get away from that being perceived as a pushy salesperson who just wants to reach into my pocket is that you've asked me a question or you've somehow demonstrated that you care about me and you're interested in where I want to go and what's important to me.
So here's the tip. Imagine that you are a doctor and you're just about to diagnose a patient's disease, illness, or issue. Or in our world, it's a prospect's business problem. Well, before diving into question after question after question, wouldn't you want to establish a little bit of context first? That's what we're going to do with these opening lines. So to transition from the pleasantries to your actual questions, you might go, okay, we can get started if you like. The prospect goes, yes, please. Then you're going to frame up the conversation like this. You're going to say, great. Well, the way these calls usually go is I'll ask you a few questions. We'll see if you're a good fit for what we do. If you are a good fit, I'll explain our product or service, and then you can let me know if you want to move forward with it or not. Does that sound good? And this transition builds rapport and sets you up to be able to ask those all-important qualifying questions because it sets expectations. You establish the flow of the call and you're letting the prospect know what to expect moving forward. It also positions you as the expert. By mentioning usually, you show that you've got experience and you've got a proven process and you've done this tens, if not hundreds of times. And it also empowers the buyer. You're giving the buyer at least a feeling, right? A feeling of being in control, that they get the final say because you go, well, if you want to work with us, great. If not, no worries. And this alone builds absolutely massive levels of trust, and it encourages the buyer to open up and to drop that shield that all people have when they engage with salespeople. It encourages to drop that right at the beginning of the call itself. Remember, keep all of this friendly, keep it confident, put your chin up as you're speaking, add a few pauses here and there. And this sets the stage for a massively productive meeting where you can diagnose the buyer's needs and ultimately you get to close the deal. And we're going to talk about wrapping up the call smoothly with another transition called the close transition in the last step in this video. So stick around for that because next we're going to cover how to transition to the value proposition. Okay, Sales Nation, let's say now that you've done your intro, you've transitioned, you've asked a few questions. Now you need to transition again as you've identified your prospect's pain points. And now it's time to show them how your product or service can resolve the pain that they're in. But here's the thing, transitioning from a diagnosis part of a call to a value proposition can feel, well, a little bit awkward, but don't worry, I've got your back. Imagine this, right? You're talking to your doctor, they've asked you a series of questions, they've poked, they've prodded, figuratively or maybe even literally, and now they have a good understanding of what's going on in your world. But it'd be weird for them to just leave you hanging there, right? Next, they'd explain how they can help you feel better. And that's what we've got to do on your discovery calls. We've got to transition from one stage of understanding to the next stage of curing, or at least explaining how we can potentially cure the issue. Gene Norton talked about this idea on a recent episode of the Salesman podcast.
What you want to understand is there a gap? Is there a gap between where they are and where they want to be? Is there something they're trying to do that they're not getting the outcome of? Because the truth is, Baron, if there's no gap, there's no sale. And our job as sellers is to understand that gap like a doctor would and be prepared to make a prescription.
And so this is where we're going to introduce what's called the value bridge. We need to create a smooth bridge that explains the buyer's current reality, their future reality, and how we can get them from one side to another. And here's the one-liner that I use all the time to make this transition. I ask the buyer, okay, well, would it make sense for me to explain what we do and how we can potentially help. Hopefully the buyer goes, yes, please tell me more. And you go, okay, awesome. We help X person solve Y problem with Z process. For you, it would look like 1, 2, 3, then carry on down your value proposition line. And this transition line packs a couple of important punches. First off, you get permission rather than putting pressure on the buyer. You're not forcing a sales pitch down their throat. You're going, okay, I think we can help. Would it make sense if I tell you how this works? You're subtly asking for permission to explain how your solution can address their needs. This builds massive trust, shows respect, and also balances you out. You become less of this cocky, stereotypical growth salesperson and more of a consultant in line with the buyer. And it also starts to build a little bit of intrigue by saying we help X person solve Y problem Z way. You've tied that to their specific issues, problems, how you think you can resolve it. And if logically that makes sense to the buyer, they're of course gonna want to know more on how it all works. And finally, at least the perceived element of this, the perceived control is in their court. It again gives the buyer perceived control. They can say yes at this point, they can say no. And this reinforces the feeling that this demo is a collaboration rather than, again, what I say all the time, which is what most salespeople do. They get their pitch, they try and force it as deep and as hard down the buyer's throat as they possibly can. And it's important here to personalize your value proposition. Don't just say, we help companies. Be specific. Say, we help sales managers in the SaaS industry close deals faster by providing a streamlined sales qualification process, whatever it may be. The more that you can personalize this transition, this value proposition to the buyer, their circumstance, their industry, their job titles, the more effective all of this is. Because now you're speaking to them as a person, as opposed to what most salespeople do, which is speak to prospects as they are an avatar. You're going to connect with them at a deeper level, and you're going to show them a clear vision of how you think you can solve their problem and move things forward. Remember, this discovery call is a conversation, or it should be, rather than a monologue. Pay close attention to your buyer's responses to your questions. If they say yes, dive into your value proposition, explain your product or service and how it can address their specific needs. If they hesitate, well, don't be afraid of asking further clarifying questions to understand their concerns better. And at this point, we haven't quite got to the happily ever after moment just yet. But by building trust, demonstrating this value, giving the buyer open-ended questions to yes or no answer to, you're laying the groundwork for a smooth transition into the closing phase, which we're going to cover next. So towards the end of your discovery call, when you've diagnosed your buyer's pain points, their problems, you've showcased how your amazing product can be the cure to their issues, now it's time to navigate to what most salespeople feel like is the tricky part, but it should be the easiest if the rest of it has gone to plan. We're going to transition from the value proposition stage, essentially explaining how we can help, to the next stage in the sales process, which is where we're going to close the next meeting, the deal, whatever it is we're trying to close at the end of this call. No matter what you're trying to close, the key here is to make this transition as smooth as possible. It shouldn't be a jarring set of gear shifts like when you're first learning to drive. It should be absolutely seamless and you should just sweep straight through it. So with that said, here is a powerful script to help you bridge that gap. You might go, okay, Jack, throughout our conversation, we talked about going from struggling to close deals, point A, to consistently exceeding your sales quota, point B. Have I explained everything clearly, or are there any gaps that would prevent you from perhaps reaching that goal? So here we are somewhat trying to bait the buyer to go, yep, that makes sense. Everything you've explained would get me from A to point B, and they've told you what point A and point B are. They must want to get there, otherwise they wouldn't have told you those specific points. And by personalizing your close like this, you're going to make it really resonate with your prospect at a deep level. And this works for a couple of reasons, right? First off, we're reframing the conversation. We're not pressuring them to buy, which is the stereotypical sales process that most people go through, which is why they hate dealing with salespeople. You're simply confirming that their goals, going from A to B, are accurate. And we're also ensuring at a high level that our solution is what's going to get them from one place to another. We also open the door for questions. And this transition gives the prospect a chance to voice any concerns before we start moving forward rapidly towards the end of the sale. And obviously it shows that you're genuinely interested in their specific situation. And it sets the stage for the final close. Because at this point, if there are any potential roadblocks, if there are any objections, the buyer's going to throw them at you. And it's much easier to deal with objections before you ask for the business or you ask the next meeting and the buyer says no. Once someone says no, they are pretty set in stone. Once we make a firm decision and we communicate it out into the universe, well, we don't like to change it, which is dumb. That's a stupid way of living your life. but that's how we're all wired. So if we can address any potential roadblocks, if we can bring them up before we get to that final part of the process where we ask, hey, does it make sense to do this? And we can deal with them ahead of time. It means that we're more likely to get a yes when we finally close the next meeting. Okay, so once they confirm everything sounds good, you can then smoothly transition to the next and final step. And we're going to close the demo. And it could sound something as simple as like, okay, great. Does it make sense to schedule a demo next week sometime so you can see how our product or service works in action? Or if you're not going from discovery to a demo, you might ask, okay, perfect. Would it be helpful to set a follow-up meeting with your team to discuss all of this further? Or if it's a one-call close, like what I do typically over at salesman.com Academy, you might go, okay, awesome. Well, based on what you discussed, you want to get from A to B, you think we can get you from one side to the other. Are you ready to move forward with wherever your product or service is? And again, I'm trying to reiterate this point over and over and over again. This is a conversation, so be flexible and adapt your responses based on their response. If the buyer hesitates, don't be afraid to ask clarifying questions or to address any concerns that they have. The goal is to guide them, to nudge them, to help them move confidently towards the next step in the sales process, whatever that may be. The goal isn't to beat them up, ask weird manipulative questions, and to bully them into the next meeting, because they're not going to show up, they're just going to ghost you, and all of this is going to have been a complete waste of time. Remember, sales discovery calls are absolutely the key way to boosting your closing rate. And if you want to learn how to write email subject lines that grab attention so you can book more meetings and get on more discovery calls, click the video that's on the screen right now and continue making selling simple.